All right, good morning, Mike.
Morning, Dave.
I have a question for you.
Sure thing.
Pressure versus shift.
The
We
great
always talk about, we let's just connect the dots, but it's not so easy to connect the dots sometimes. And this thing came up recently of like, why do we take the header to the shift? There's got to be a reason.
Yeah, and the answer is you don't always take the header to the shift. It really depends on the wind.
What?
Yeah, of course. So in the really broad base of it is like what I always say somebody is, it's really light right now. And if we get a little more breeze, we could double our speed. If we're going 1.5 knots and we can go 3, that's double your speed. Like, is there any shift that's going to make up for doubling your speed? Probably not. So if you're going really slow, you want to go find pressure almost at all costs. So that's one extreme. The other extreme is when it's super windy. And once you get to hull speed, unless you're in a planing boat, there's a couple boats playing upwind, or a catamaran just goes a little faster and flash. But most boats that people sail are displacement boats. And once you get to that displacement hull speed, whatever it is, you're not going to go much faster with more breeze. I might even argue if it started to blow 40, there's so much windage, you might even slow down if there's more breeze, right? But once you get the hull speed, which is at a pretty low wind, 10 knots or something, 10, 11, 12, you're getting close anyway. You just get infinitesimally faster as you get breeze. So it's kind of the opposite, right? Like even the littlest shift is more important than a gigantic amount of of extra breeze.
How little is what is the difference between a little and a lot?
Well, I've always kind of talked anecdotally about that. Like I've talked about the two extremes, and I've always said, well, and in between, it's a combination of the two. As it gets closer to windy, it gets more and more about shift, and as it gets lighter and lighter, it gets more and more about pressure. But it's never absolutely one or the other. There's always a little bit of help from breeze, and always a little help from shift when it's light. But so you can't just ignore them. But I got to admit, I started getting into the math, and I just got a little carried away.
You got some math.
Share some of that with you.
All right. We should have one of those math alert, type things. So pay attention, right?
That's right. Yeah, this is math class, but it's math class that we kind of skim over the math, but we get to the results pretty quickly. So
okay, thank God. Okay.
Yeah.
I do words, not numbers. Okay.
Yeah, right. So I just found I got the J80 pullers the old-fashioned way. I pulled them off the internet, and I just picked J80 because I just picked the J80. It doesn't really matter. But, just to remind everybody, I love this, the way I picked this one, because I like that they use colors for each different wind range. And to remind all of you, how a puller works here, this blue line is the boat speed for different sailing angles. So this would be head to wind. This would be a dead run. This is the beam reach for 3 knots. So the blue is 3 knots. A slightly lighter blue is 6, then 9, and so on, all the way up till you get to 30 knots of breeze. And the relevant numbers we're looking for here are all about upwind. So everything about here, after you go from a reach to downwind, we're not looking for that right now. That's a whole different discussion.
90 and above.
What's that?
90 and above, or 70, 80 and above.
Right. And so 80 and above, or probably 50 and above, right? This is you're on the wind, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what you really care about is where this line intercepts here. So this is your VMG. So this is how fast you're going dead upwind. And this is your actual boat speed. So for each of these, you're going to see where this comes into play. But those are the numbers that I care about for this. Those are the numbers I wrote down. So for example, at 3 knots, if you go up each one of these these semicircles are a knot of boat speed. So at 3 knots of breeze, you're going 1, 2, just under 3 knots when you're going upwind. So let's back up a second. This maximum peak right here, where it intersects over here, is your VMG. So that's 1 knot upwind. So right here, you're going like 1.6 knots VMG, while your boat is actually going 1, 2, 2.3 or something, right? And then you do the same thing for this. So at, let's just jump to 9 knots. You're the peak is right here, and that is, you go intersect here, you're going 1, 2, 3, you're basically going 4 knots VMG, and your boat speed is actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5.2. And this number 5.2 would turn into that's where these targets come from. So when you get a target boat speed for J80 of 5.2 in, how many breeze? I said 9 knots a breeze, that's where it comes from. And if you're going 5.0, you're probably going a little too high and your VMG goes down. And if you're going 6, you're probably going a little too low, going a little too fast forward, but it's not VMG. This peak is what matters. So, the first thing you notice when you look at this is a little bit of wind increase here changes both your boat speed and your VMG a lot. 3 knots per here.
Yeah.
And then once you get here, like, it barely changes at all. This is when you're getting to hull speed I was talking about. So it proved out what I see in real life. Anyway, I spent a lot of time on the polars, so I should move on quickly, right?
Yeah. So what does this mean?
Yeah. What is this?
So let's imagine, you've got, there's a breeze line ahead. Somebody says there's good pressure ahead. But I'm in this header. What do I do?
Well, I'm not going to answer your question right away because I'm going to fill in the gaps, and then we're going to come back to that. And maybe you can give me a couple examples. What would you do if?
Yeah.
Let's get the facts first. So taking those numbers, I just plotted those numbers on a graph. And this is where I did a bunch of these graphs. I apologize in advance. I got a little carried away, but it was kind of a fun project. And this says the same thing. Your VMG, when it's 3 knots, is 1.6 or 7. And it increases a lot with a little bit of breeze. And then at some point, it levels out until it doesn't change at all with more breeze. You don't get any more speed. So this backs up the fact that it's, pressure early, and pressure doesn't matter when it's windy. It's better when it's light. All right. So, but how does that work compared to a shift? And I'm like, well, what if you got a 10-degree shift? How does that compare? I'm like, well, for each of these wind speeds, how much extra speed do you get for a 10-degree shift? And 10-degree shift, as it turns out, I did some trigonometry, is an 18% VMG change if you're starting at 45 degrees to the wind. So if you plot that, so you go, a shift of 10 degrees gives you 18% VMG. That's a lot. 10 degrees is a very significant shift. But in the low range, an 18% increase doesn't increase it a ton. And even though it doesn't, and it increases it more in your actual speed as it gets windier. All right. But the relevance of that is, if you look at this, let's put real numbers on this. Essentially, a 10-degree shift when it's light is worth a half a knot, or even at 6 knots, it's worth a knot of breeze. So 1 extra knot of breeze is the equivalent to 10-degree shift. So if you, in the light air, you'd need just a tiny bit of breeze to make up for a 10-degree shift, probably almost imperceptible to you. Somewhere in the middle, you need a whole knot of breeze to make up for 10. So 1 knot of breeze, do you take the shift or the puff, yeah, exactly, the shift or the puff? Gives be a toss-up. That doubles with just a little bit of breeze. And then before you know it, it takes 5 full knots of breeze, only at 7 knots. And then once you get to hull speed at 9 knots or so of breeze, there's no amount of extra breeze that's going to make up for 10-degree shift.
Ipso facto, I guess they say in the smarter world, pressure in light air is more important than shift.
Right.
Once you get into the upper range of the puff, doesn't matter.
Right.
Or it doesn't matter, but it matters less.
It matters less. Well, I would almost say it to some point, look how flat this curve is. It almost doesn't matter at all. Like once you get to like 15 knots, it matters just a tiny bit from 9 to 15, and then it doesn't matter at all. And I wonder if you took this out, I think I mentioned it before, if it was blowing 40, the speed would probably go down with more breeze, right?
Especially when the rig comes down very slow.
Yeah. I'm just thinking just windage, just the drag of the sails. Like you just, some places you can't go forward anymore. All right, I'm going to geek out on you one more level before we can go bring this back to earth and what we actually do. And I said, well, what's the biggest shift? This is for 10 degrees. So what if you had a gigantic shift? Would that be worth taking in light air? We already know when it gets windy, there's no question. Like, I bet you a 3-degree shift would be more important than breeze at 10 knots of breeze. So, by the way, I'm not sure I realized how extreme it was. Like, I had this all in my head that I play pressure and light air and shift and heavy. I don't think I quite understood it was this dramatic until I put it in paper. So what's the biggest shift you could have? Well, it's a 45-degree shift, right? If you're directly below the mark and you got a 45-degree shift, you're pointing directly at the mark. So what does that look like when you graph it? Well, that looks like, even with a 45-degree shift, when you're pointing directly at the mark, which is a crazy big shift, it's not that big a difference when it's light, and it's pretty big when it's heavy. So finishing that up, when it's light, 1 knot of breeze more is equivalent to a 45-degree shift. And this was the one I thought was super interesting. At 6 knots, you basically had to double your wind speed to make up for a 45-degree shift. So major shift, major puff are competing. So what that means is when it's super light, it's almost all pressure. When it's super windy, it's almost all shift. And in between, you're going to make some judgment calls. The lighter it is, the more you kind of lean toward the lighter. As you get toward, as it gets a little windier, more you lean toward shift. I would say the biggest thing I learned from doing this little study was that how quickly it shifted from, like, it was a lower number that it shifted to shift mattering. We're only at 7 knots, 9 knots of breeze, no white caps yet and everything. And already shift is way more important than pressure.
Amazing.
I kind of figured once you're hiking full and deep powering, that was really compelling. I think it's, what I've learned from this little study is it's compelling earlier than I thought. You get to hull speed at a lower wind speed than I guess I recognize. You get close at 9 knots of breeze. Which
is what most of us end up racing in anywhere, somewhere in this sort of middle light to common ground. Once you get into the other extreme, they're postponing and whatever else. So the vast majority of racing is done in this wind range.
Yeah, even though it's a narrow range, it's what we probably do most of our racing in. You're a good point.
Yeah. So what about hull speed and the different types of boats? What's the overlying factor of that versus, let's say, a quicker planing dinghy like the Melges 15 or something like that can eat that distance up pretty quick versus this J80 or a J24?
Yeah, no, I think once you start planing upwind, if you're in a 470, a 505 or something, or maybe you're in a catamaran that kind of doesn't really plane anyway, it just goes faster and faster. I think this pressure still matters. I remember when I was sailing cats all the time, when I first got in it, and they're like, Randy Smythe would always say, pressure's king, pressure's king. Yeah, but it's windy, it's still king, because you just go faster and faster. So I think those are one of the exceptions. But I think the key number there is, what's wind speed does your boat get up to hull speed? If it's a displacement boat. I think if it's a planing boat or a cat or a foiling boat, you're still thinking pressure as much, even as it gets windier. But if you're in a displacement boat, you have to know the number that your boat gets up to hull speed. So either you have an instrument and hull speed's 6.1 knots, 5.2 knots, whatever your hull speed is. And as you get close to that, as soon as you get to 4.8 or something, all right, now the transition to shift. Or you just have to kind of know that number, But I'll bet you most boats are kind of in that range. They're getting to hull speed, 9 knots. a boat's maybe an underpowered rig, maybe it's a little later. If it's, a giant main like a Thistle, maybe you get there at 6-7 knots. A heavy keelboat, maybe a little bit more, but I bet it's a narrower range than we think.
What about, this may be getting too deep, in terms of like the tack loss, right? And you're sort of like tacking to go find, you're hunting pressure. Oh, well, ignore the shift. Let's go get that breeze over there. At what point in time are you over tacking to get to the breeze you need to?
Well, you could say the same thing about a shift. How are you over tacking to take this shift that's only going to last, think about those cat paw shifts, right?
Yeah.
Like if it's just going to shift and then shift right back, is it worth tacking twice? So it's the same question. And, that has to do with, how much you lose in your tack. If it's a college 420, you're probably going to gain in the tack. So it's worth it, right? And if you're losing, like most displacement keelboats probably lose roughly 3/4, and they probably lose less as it gets windier. So, I always think of the, practically speaking, if it's light wind, you're not tacking like, oh, there's a little puff of zephyr there, I'm going to tack for that. You're not connecting the zephyrs when it's light. You're like, I see wind on the left, I got to send it, you kind of don't have a choice but to go all the way, because if you don't go all the way, you're not going to get the full effect of it. So I think you kind of take the little shifts along the way, the little lulls along the way. You're on the same tack what it seems like forever, practically speaking.
And how about sort of like the 5 seconds, 10 seconds on, sail trim when you want to take the header to get to the pressure?
Yeah, well, so if you're taking the header, I do think, a whole nother subject is, and we've written articles about this before too, is you pinch through the lull, right? Like it's is it a velocity header? So if you get a lull and you're still moving and the wind goes forward for that, do you follow it down or do you just kind of wait it out? And I think the answer is you wait it out a little. If it's a true header and you still want to keep going because you're like, no, I can't tack on this header, then you just have to bear off and suck it up.
And for how long do you suck it up?
Until you get into the pressure. Pressure is so important, and if it's a 45-degree shift, what's going to happen is the other tack will get you to the pressure. Like you're getting to that pressure almost no matter what. And if you're sailing actually away from the mark, then if you tack, you're sailing still toward the pressure to get to it, right? You know what I mean? Like you're sort of taking the shift, whatever angle gets you to the pressure. The shift matters only to get you to the pressure. It's relative to the pressure, not to where the mark is almost.
Yeah. Okay, then final question that we see that a lot here in Newport, sort of paint a scenario, offshore, in the morning, summertime, the southeast corner is good. You kind of get to the left corner, but there's always that guy that goes a little more, is he going more for, how deep do you go into the pressure before you reap all the benefits?
I think if we go back to this PowerPoint, it kind of tells you everything. So if it's light, it's worth digging as deep in as you need to get to the max pressure, because you're just going to go so much faster. A half a knot of breeze. If you dig a little deeper and you get a half a knot more, you're going to go so much faster that it's worth it, right? So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is if you think you kind of get to the edge and it is what it is, then you got to go. But I think the lighter it is, the more you're willing to chase pressure. You're willing to go all the way to a ley line, all the way to a corner. It's that condition I hate, because I hate going to a corner, but this is when you have to go to a corner. Of course, you have to be right. You have to get to that corner and the wind still has to be there.
Yeah.
And sometimes it just appears on the other side and you're dead. But That's the way it
So the
goes.
takeaway being that, it's sort of like if you're taking the header to get to the pressure, don't tack away from it as soon as you get to it. And dig a little deeper into it, take full advantage.
Correct. Look into it, decide whether it's gonna, if you're not in the heart of it yet, you got to keep going.
Yeah.
Yep.
Good stuff. All right, I'm gonna go hunt some breeze. It's a beautiful day here in Newport.
Good.
All right, thanks for the wisdom, Mike. Appreciate it. And for the math, we'll see you
No
next
problem.
week.
Thanks, Dave.